Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars share Iowa stories and the history of the state through a cultural history lens on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will explore the remarkable story of the Delbert and Grace Meier House, the third Frank Lloyd Wright-designed building in Iowa. A short video about the history of the house will be shown during the presentation, and a link for the video will be provided in the chat as well as in the follow-up email. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speakers. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Meier is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speakers at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our two presenters. Jason Loper has made a career out of caring for homes, whether as a butler, designer, writer, editor, or creator of digital content for consumer brands. Jason's goal is to make the world a more beautiful and comfortable place. This American House is his first book. Michael Schreiber's debut book, One Man Show, The Life and Art of Bernard Perlin, was named the Stonewall Honor Book by the American Library Association and is being adapted into a feature-length film. This American House is his second book. He continues his work of the past 20 years, guiding the cognitive, emotional, and social development of young adults with autism and other developmental challenges. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Jason and Michael to begin the webinar.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jason.
Hello, I'm Michael.
Thank you very much, Jennifer and Matt, and the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs for having us, and the State Historical Society of Iowa for having us.
And we just want to take a moment to express our gratitude for the wonderful award that the State Historical Society bestowed upon our book and house project this past year.
So to kick things off, we're going to show you a short video that'll give you an overview of our house and its history and the work we've done on the house. Quick little note that the first minute of the video doesn't have any audio, and then music will kick in. So don't crank up your volume expecting you're missing something, because then it'll blare.
You'll get a surprise.
So coming right up with that video. All right, so if you're still awake, that gave you a nice little overview of the house, but now we're going to go a little bit deeper into it. And we're going to start with a brief history of Delbert and Grace Meyer. It was Delbert and Grace who built the house back in 1917, and they actually have a lot of very interesting connections to Iowa.
Yeah, in fact, the Meyers were a family with very deep roots in Iowa. Grace Meyer's family were the founders of Upper Iowa University in Fayette. And Delbert Meyer was born and raised on a farm near Postville. The two of them actually met at Upper Iowa University right around 1900. What was pretty remarkable about Grace Burgess was her maiden name, and she came from the Robertson family who had founded the university, was that they set up that college to educate not only their sons, but also their daughters in the late 1800s, which was pretty progressive at the time. So Delbert and Grace meet at Upper Iowa University and marry shortly after graduating. And he then goes on to the University of Chicago to law school, graduating in 1906. After some time in Oklahoma, they decide to come back to northeastern Iowa, back to Clayton County, and they settle in the little town of Monona, where he establishes a law practice. She had been a school teacher, but once they had their two daughters, she stayed home with the girls. And it was about, maybe about 10 years into their time in Monona when they got the bug to build themselves a new house. And how and why they chose to build an American system-built homes, which was Frank Lloyd Wright's effort to jump into the then very lucrative market that Sears Roebuck was dominating, with mail order homes designed to be affordable for the middle classes. Frank Lloyd Wright decided to get into that market, but design architecturally distinctive homes and developed a very ambitious scheme with a partner, a man named Arthur Richards, who was a Milwaukee real estate developer. And they decided what they would do is control every element of this scheme. They purchased, Richards owned a lumber company. So they would supply all the materials. They developed a system of salespeople and offices throughout the Midwest, beginning in Illinois and Wisconsin, with hopes that they would spread nationwide.
And it's no coincidence that they're called the American system-built homes. Wright looked at these Sears catalog of homes and saw all these influences from Europe and from other places, and he identified that no, we need an American style of architecture, and that's why these American system-built homes were very prairie style, that style that he was trying to make the American standard of architecture.
Yeah, the signature style. And it's interesting to note that Frank Lloyd Wright himself had an Iowa connection, a personal Iowa connection, and one that brought him very close to Monona, just a mere few miles away from Monona, in McGregor, as a very young tot. He had spent a couple of years there. His father, William Carey Wright, was a minister and had traveled from parish to parish, a Baptist minister, and had been stationed in McGregor for a time. And in fact, it was there that the first known photograph of Frank Lloyd Wright as a very young man, very young boy, in fact, was taken. But the Meyer house would become the third Wright structure built in the state of Iowa, of just under a dozen total, following the Stockman House in Mason City, and also in Mason City, the City National Bank and Park Inn Hotel building. And those were both up by 1908 to 1910. So just 7 years later, this unique custom ready-made house comes into being in Monona, built by Delbert and Grace Meyer. How and why the Meyers chose to build one of these American system-built homes remains a bit of a mystery. Now, we do know that Del Meyer was a graduate student, as I had mentioned, at the University of Chicago. in the very early 1900s, where he may have become aware of Frank Lloyd Wright's growing fame as an architect. They may also have been well aware of the buildings in Mason City, either through Delbert's law work that may have taken him there. He was very active in the Iowa Bar Association. Also very involved. He was a delegate at the Iowa Republican National Convention in 1912. So they were a very worldly, very traveled, at least around Iowa, Iowa-centric family.
We do know that Delbert and Grace also like to take motoring trips, and so there is a potential that they would have driven to Mason City, you know, at the opening of the new hotel there. And, you know, like Michael mentioned, you know, you can't spend any time in Chicago without coming across some of Frank Lloyd Wright's designs. So he could have simply fallen in love with that while he was here. And then when the time came when they wanted to build their own house, and, you know, the American system built homes were a going commodity, he might have, you know, thought that this was his opportunity to have a little piece of that Frank Lloyd Wright architecture without the expense and the drama of a custom built Frank Lloyd Wright home.
Because the beauty of the American System Built Home project was that Wright could remove himself from needing to be on site and directly supervising the work. So essentially what would happen, a prospective home buyer could come into a regional office, could look at a set of templates of different housing design plans. And these ranged from small bungalows to a two-story home like what the Meyer house is, to two flat apartment structures, to even apartment buildings. So there was a wide variety of structures. And then even within, say, a bungalow plan, you as a prospective homeowner had a number of custom options. While the floor plans were pretty set, you could reverse floor plans depending on the demands of the location on which you were building the house. You could move a porch from one side to another, choose to leave something out. But everything was there for you to choose from, down to the fixtures. So while you in some ways felt like you were having some creative collaboration with the design of your home, Wright was controlling every last little detail of it. So in the end, you were still truly getting a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And the beauty of this system was that they were meant to be affordable for the middle classes. So the Meyers, in looking at other options then, the very popular Sears Roebuck homes, there was also the Gordon Van Tyne Company out of Davenport, Iowa, more locally based, another mail order ready-made home scheme. They somehow decided to go with the Wright house, a Meyer house.
And unlike the Sears and Van Dyne homes, where you would receive the materials, but it was up to you, the owner, to then build the house, the American System Built homes, all of the materials were shipped to you. In the case of the Meyer house, they would have come on rail. The train still runs right through the middle of town, and it's just 2 blocks away from the Meyer house. And then there were contractors who would build the house for you. So that may have also appealed to someone like Delbert and Grace, who wanted a house, a brand newly built house, but didn't want to do the building of it, the constructing of it themselves.
Now, we're suspicious that Delbert Meyer may have played a bit of a hand in the actual construction of the house, only in that he was an avid woodworker, furniture builder. And its houses seemed to inspire in its subsequent owners, people who have been very creatively collaborative with the house in their own ways, making adaptations as the years have gone on. But we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. The challenge and the ultimate problem and then failure for the American System Built Homes project was that it was launched just as the United States was entering World War I, which resulted in, as we're seeing now, shortages of materials and therefore elevated prices for materials, for housing materials. So that really cooled the scheme. And in fact, we know from the Meyer the family members with whom we've spoken that Delbert and Grace themselves had trouble getting materials for their house. Its construction began in the spring of 1917, and but it was ready for them to move in November of that year. And the Meyers would remain in that home for the remainder of their lives until the early 1960s. So they had quite a long tenure in the house. And from what we've been told by the family, the house remained virtually unchanged through their many years of stewardship.
And in addition to the shortages that we experienced in World War I that kind of spelled the doom of the American System-Built Home Project, Wright was had a bit of an ego, as you might have heard. And so I think we think that he may have actually not approved of the way some of the houses were built or some of the changes that were made. And he didn't have that full control that he had really wanted. He did return to the prefab home project a couple more times in his career, though. So this was clearly something that he was passionate about, creating homes for the everyman that could, fill the country. The American System of Home Project was a ginormous project. There were close to 1,000 drawings made for it. So he really intended this to be like
dominate the market. He wanted to dominate the housing market, the ready-made housing market, the affordable housing market with this scheme. And unfortunately, it was doomed to fail. As Jason said, just between circumstances, the entry into the war, but also ego. And Wright and his business partner in this scheme, Arthur Richards, ended up in court in a lawsuit, although would later reconcile and work somewhat together later on.
And then interestingly, even though Wright did return to prefab, he really distanced himself from the American System-Built Home Project through the rest of his life. And the American System-Built homes flew under the radar for many years. You saw in the video that a previous owner, Becky Olafson, had contacted the
Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation
to authenticate the house because back in the 80s, no one really knew about these. A lot of them had already been torn down. There was a beautiful apartment building in Milwaukee that had been demolished to make way for a road widening. Another house similar to ours in Gary that burnt down and had been neglected for years. So it's great that these houses are starting to get their due now, all these years later. With our book, there is a house in the suburbs of not Milwaukee, the Murphy House.
Yeah, Milwaukee.
Yeah, of Milwaukee, I'm sure, yes.
Milwaukee.
Of Milwaukee,
Sure.
they've also written a book about their house. It's also a recently discovered American System-Built home. So there may be more lingering out there. Like we said at the outset, ours is the only one in Iowa. Most of these houses are in Milwaukee, the Chicago area.
Madison.
There's actually a sister house to our house at the exact same floor plan, although it's been tweaked considerably. That's here on the south side of Chicago. And we've gotten to know the owners, and it's really fun comparing notes then about the difference between the two houses.
Yeah, by our estimation, only around 20 of these American System-Built home structures of varying kinds, bungalows, two-story houses, were ever built. And in fact, if anyone is aware of the Burnham Block in Milwaukee, it's a wonderful ongoing project, and a nonprofit is restoring a block of what were originally built as demonstration models for the American System-Built Home Project. And it was an entire block of some 2 flats and some bungalows. So their work really began to elevate awareness of the American System-Built Home Project. But when we bought this house, there was really little known and very little that we could ourselves learn about this house or its history or the history of this scheme. We traveled to the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University in New York, where all of the drawings are now kept, and poured over hundreds and hundreds, literally hundreds of drawings, to find the exact prints, the floor plans and blueprints and specifications for our house. And then it was just through a lot of research that we were able to suss out more of this history. Also, buying a house in small town Iowa brought with it a really unexpected treasure, in that small town, everyone knows everyone. Everyone knew the house, knows the house. And so we were so fortunate very quickly to begin to meet and get to know previous owners or family members of people who have inhabited the house before us for the past 100 years. And so it was just wonderful to be able to collect their stories and certainly their photos. Any photos that showed children's birthday parties or family events or whatever that might show details of the house in the background were just gold for us as we've been working our way through this history.
Yeah, and Michael touched on the fact that the Burnham block were spec houses. Actually, the two houses on the south side of Chicago were also spec houses. They intended them to be model homes, and then they would build an entire neighborhood of them. So a unique aspect of the Meyer house is it's one of the few American system-built homes that was built by an actual owner. Most of the others that we know of were built as model homes. So that's another interesting aspect for the Meyers, that they chose to buy into this housing system and to build this house themselves. They weren't, speculators. They never intended for Monona to become an American system-built hometown. They just chose to build this very unique prairie-style house.
And as we said, they made it their family home for the rest of their lives, Delbert and Grace. And afterwards, the house saw some subsequent owners who made functional changes to the house as the times mandated. Once the Meyers were gone, and even during their stewardship, the house was not known locally or branded in any way as a Frank Lloyd Wright house. No one really thought of it as a Frank Lloyd Wright house. It was just the Meyer house. And so as the times changed, a family who came in the 60s pulled out some of the original built-ins and painted over woodwork just to lighten things up. Outdated kitchen and bathroom was ultimately renovated to accommodate new appliances and just to keep up with the times. When we came into our stewardship of the house nearly 10 years ago, we decided at first we had great plans to just bring everything back. It would be a huge endeavor and a huge expense to bring it all back in a very restorative, historically preserved kind of way. But we began to recognize that this has been a family home, as was its original intention, for over 100 years, and that some of the adaptations that have been made to the house over the years, like a more modern kitchen, for example, and a more modern bathroom, were things that we were not going to turn the clock back on. So we really dedicated our efforts to just trying to bring back the elements that we could, stripping paint off of woodwork, and it was all the original woodwork is still there and beautiful. Happily, the original art glass windows were still in place, and all the original doors, which were unpainted. And most remarkably of all, the house still retains its 100-year-old exterior stucco, and it's a very unique stucco. It's a pebble dash stucco that has little bits of quartz crystal blown into it, along with little black pebbles. And at certain times of day, the whole house just shimmers beautifully.
On a sunny day, especially in the winter, the house just sparkles. It's absolutely beautiful. Every owner of the house has had a deep Iowa connection. Part of that is that this house is in a small town in northeastern Iowa. There's really no major city near it. It's an hour from Dubuque, like an hour and a half from Mason City, from Madison.
Right.
So it has really attracted, local people. So that may make you wonder, how did two guys from Chicago end up buying this house in small town Iowa? Well, I'm glad you asked. We had been looking for a cabin, a little getaway. We had both been living in Chicago for more than 10 years, and every year or so we would take little vacations and rent cabins and vacation homes. And every time we were in those spaces, we would start dreaming about, what if this was ours? Sometimes going as far as like moving some furniture around to make it work with how we would want it to be. Don't worry, we moved it all back before we left. But so finally, we went looking for our own little cabin, and we found the cutest little custom-built cabin in Spring Green, Wisconsin. Built in the 70s by an amateur architect. It was everything that we had been looking for. It had about an acre of land around it, so it was very private. Just a small 2-bedroom. So we thought, this is it. This is our little cabin getaway. And while we were there for inspections and walkthroughs, we also then really started to explore Spring Green more. And of course, that is home to Taliesin. And so then we started to dream, won't it be neat? We're right here in Frank Lloyd Wright's backyard in our own little custom built house. This is going to be so wonderful. And when people come to visit, we'll have all these things to do with them. Well, fast forward to the actual house inspection, and it turns out that it had a host of problems, but the biggest problem was that it had a homemade septic system that was pretty close to failing. And in fact, the inspector said, I'm really surprised that we didn't fall through the top of the holding tank directly into the waste that's held in the septic system. So that was enough for us to walk away from that exciting purchase, because it was no longer exciting. Unbeknownst to me, while we were doing that, Michael had seen this Frank Lloyd Wright-designed house in Monona, Iowa. And so when the cabin fell through, we were completely disheartened, because we had been looking for the better part of a year for a getaway, within 2 to 3 hours of Chicago. So Michael brought up this listing of the Meyer house in Monona and showed it to me. And I said, that's nothing that we want. It's too big. It's 5 hours from Chicago. It's in a town, which is not the privacy we were looking for. And it's old. It was, built in 1917. We were looking for something more mid-century that wouldn't, come with a lot of projects to do. But, as couples do, he kept kind of pointing in front of me and saying, are you sure you don't want to just go see it? And so finally I said, you're right. Let's drive out to Iowa and just see the house. This was my thinking, okay, this will just shut it down. We never have to do this again. Well, we took the most awful drive to Iowa. It was one of those blinding rainstorms where you have to pull over to the side of the road because you can't see. And I was like, see, now, are you sure? Would we really want to do this, every weekend, make this 5-hour drive in blinding rainstorms to this house in Iowa? And we were both like, no, this is just a lark. We're just going out to see it. Well, we walked into the house, and wouldn't you know, within 5 minutes, we looked at each other and we were like, we have to buy this house. This is just amazing. There's a lightness to the house. I think it's those corner windows and that bank of windows in the living room. So it really does bring the outside in. And then, of course, all the vintage charm, the prairie style with the woodwork, and those beautiful doors. We just knew right away that it had to be our house.
Yeah, the house is a perfect expression of Frank Lloyd Wright's concept of organic architecture, which was about living with nature, bringing the outside in. And so that mandated where windows were placed. And so those corner upstairs windows, the big banks of windows downstairs, just really made it feel like the house is in communion with nature. And then Jason mentioned the woodwork, the lines everywhere that just draw your eye. You know, he's manipulating you in every room, but it's wonderful. It flows you through, it moves you through spaces into other spaces. So there was just so much about the house that really hooked us from the get-go, and we could see that it was really a diamond in the rough. But it wasn't all that rough. It had been so well cared for through the years by previous stewards, that really all we really needed to do to the house was cosmetic. And by cosmetic, I mean our own list of historic preservation items that we really wanted to get to. And being an old house, of course, very quickly, it let us know that it had some needs. So every year there was some big expense, you know, an exterior paint job, getting a chimney relined, you know, gutters replaced, things of that nature. But it was really a wondrous experience.
And so we spent almost 9 years driving back and forth. Our home base remains in Chicago because our work is here. So we would take, you know, long weekends. We treasured holiday weekends when we could get long stretches at the house. The pandemic, while terrible, was a fresh opportunity for us to spend really long stretches at the house. At the time, we were renting a studio apartment here in Chicago, so we were so grateful to have a 3-bedroom home to go spend our time in. I mostly worked on the projects. Michael worked on the research, and developing those relationships with the previous owners so that we could collect their stories. And then we collaborated on the book. But I have to admit that this year was the year that we started to recognize this may be bigger than us and a little more than we're able to sustain. We put probably 100,000 miles on both of our cars in the drives back and forth. And put many years of gray hair on our heads from worrying about the storms that would move through when we were stuck in Chicago and couldn't get there to check on it. So we did make the decision earlier this year to sell the house. And we found a couple in Monona who had been admiring the house. It was on the market for a day before they saw it and made an offer. And we're so pleased to know that the house is in good hands. This is a couple who has preserved some other older homes in Monona. And I've since seen some photos of some of the work they've been doing. And we're so pleased to know that the house will be in good hands. Like I mentioned earlier, there were other American system-built homes that through neglect or just misfortune are no longer standing. And we would never want to see that fate for any of the existing American system-built homes. So we're really relieved to know that while it's not our house anymore, it is still a house that is going to be loved and cared for.
Yeah, and it's truly a house that was intended by the Meyers when they built it to be their home for that Iowa family. And through the years, it has certainly served that wonderful function as a home for Iowa families through the years. And now we've left it in the hands of the loving hands of another Iowa family. So for us, it was a wonderful way to walk away from it. Although we'll never really walk away from it. It's very much in our hearts and very much in the book that we wrote, and we encourage all of you. We hope you'll have a chance, if you haven't already, to read the book, which is not a stuffy scholarly kind of book at all. It's very much the story of a house, the history of a house, and all of the people that have lived through it. We've lived in so many vintage spaces through the years, always wondering if these walls could talk, who lived here before us? What are their stories? And with the Meyer house, we had an incredible opportunity to actually ask.
The walls were
those
talking and we
walls.
were listening and taking
Yeah.
notes.
So
I think on that,
But
we
with
can
that-
open it up to any questions.
yeah, do you all have any questions for us?
Well, thank you, Michael and Jason. We have time to answer some questions. And if you do have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature right here on Zoom. But please note we may not be able to get to all the questions today. And let's dive in. Our first question, you mentioned the Avery Library Archives at Columbia University. And a link to the archives will be provided in the follow-up email that we'll send. But are the plans for these American system-built homes available online at these archives or on other websites?
Yes, actually, I do believe that the Avery Library has now, they've digitized, which had to have been a massive labor because we went through all of these drawings about 10 years ago, but that they've all been digitized, and I'm pretty sure they're available through their website. I know we've received anyway a digital copy of the entire lot of them. So we would encourage people to get on that site. Again, that's the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University. And they are now the repository. It's a collaboration, I believe, with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who now own the bulk of Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings, plans, papers, and they're kept there. So it's fascinating to look through these American system-built homes just to see the expansive nature of this scheme, all the different styles of homes that were available, and then down to all the elements. Every possible element was thought through, and there are plans there for the windows, as well as all the structural elements, you know, the joists, the roofing, the different style of roofs that you could choose, the flooring. It's all very spelled out in much detail in these plans.
And you know, I mentioned that the American system-built homes kind of flew under the radar for a while. This is a perfect story to illustrate that. When we contacted the Avery Library about the plans and they said they had them, we were going to be in New York anyway, so we made plans to go there one day. And I'm just gonna call her snooty librarian kind of like made this offhand remark, like, you're not gonna find anything about your house in there, you know, kind of just this like, well, you don't really have a Frank Lloyd Wright house kind of attitude that we had actually experienced in a few other, you know, instances as we were, you know, full of excitement about this house. And so we're going through folder after folder and we're not seeing anything about our house, and we're getting completely dispirited and thinking, oh, maybe she's right. And then we get to the last folder that's available, and there it is, the plans for our exact house.
Yeah, our house was an M202 model. And so we did find the plans for the M202 and the M203, and there were different variations because you could, you know, change out the roof style you wanted, et cetera, et cetera. But this librarian, I don't believe I think she's long since retired. But we were fearful of meeting her smug face when we came up disappointed at the end. You can imagine how smug our faces were when we informed her.
Look, we found it,
Gleefully that we found the plans.
That's great. Well, let's transition a little bit to more of the research side. Again, I think we all kind of know a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright and how he is an interesting character, I'll put it, in some ways than his life he did. But in your research, did you have a favorite surprising fact or anything that you found out about Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well, one of the most wonderful things that we've come to learn about Frank Lloyd Wright is much more about Frank Lloyd Wright's father and Frank Lloyd Wright's Iowa connections. We were contacted by Frank Lloyd Wright's great niece and her daughter, I guess just about a year ago, and we've developed a wonderful relationship with them. Hope Rogers is now 98 years old. She's Frank Lloyd Wright's great niece. Frank Lloyd Wright's father was married before he was married to Frank Lloyd Wright's mother. With his first wife, he had 3 children, and his first wife died, and then he married Anna Lloyd-Jones, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's mother. So these are half siblings. But you know, they lived in McGregor in late 1860s to early 1870s. Frank Lloyd Wright's youngest sister was born there. And Elizabeth Wright Heller, his half sister, lived out the rest of her life in Iowa, was farmed, a pioneering farmer near Ledora, Iowa. And members of that family still live in the Cedar Rapids area. So it's been really wonderful learning more about them, but learning much more about Frank Lloyd Wright's father and Frank Lloyd Wright's own autobiography. His father, who ultimately left his mother, has sort of been demonized in a way, and cast as a ne'er-do-well. And it's been a wonderful history to an actual story to resuscitate through the family, and learn that quite the contrary was true about William Carey Wright, who was a minister, but a very talented composer, and a wonderful man who ended up spending quite a lot of his life in the state of Iowa. So that's been a wonderful little perk of this house, is the wonderful people that we've met. Just people coming to tour the house, scholars reaching out, but just fans of Frank Lloyd Wright reaching out.
And the community of the other American system-built homeowners. Like I mentioned, there are a few here in the Chicago region and then Milwaukee. And we have a little Facebook group, and we've met up on occasion. They took a field trip out to us in Monona a couple of times. Seeing the different alterations that have been made to these houses over the years, sharing the war stories of, doing the work, uncovering, our own histories about each house. Again, we are fortunate that our house is in a small town in Iowa, because we're the only ones who have like this documented history of the ownership. You can imagine that a house here in Chicago that started out as a model home, there have been many owners throughout the years, and there's no way to really, track that down in the way that we could just through word of mouth in small town Monona.
Fantastic. Now, turning our head to your former home and the restoration project. This is a loaded question, but hopefully it's not too long. But any advice for someone wanting to take on a historic renovation project?
One room at a time.
Yeah.
We were given that advice and we didn't follow it, and I regret it. Start small and keep it small. You probably saw in the video, there was a scene of Michael stripping paint off the fireplace.
Oh boy, sorry.
That was a labor-intensive project that required a little bit of stripper on just a few bricks at a time, and then scraping it off with a wire brush to get through all the crevices. And there may have been an instance where we got a little overzealous and put more stripper on than we could have really stripped back off, before the end of the day. So my advice is definitely just take it slow and see if there's any support out there. We were, I think, based on our location, we weren't really able to tap into some of the resources that may have been available in larger communities. But I know, like here in Chicago, that some of the owners have been able to tap into, historical societies and other resources to get support.
That's great advice. Before I ask the last question, we actually had a personal note sent into our Q&A. Becky Gilmore wrote that her grandma used to live next door to the house for years and always been intrigued by the history of this site. It's a small world, isn't it?
Wonderful.
It's fantastic to see how much love and care you have all put into this property, and thank you for joining us today for that, showing this off. So to kind of segue into the next question, our last question today, where can people find out where to get your book?
I know that a link will be sent out after this. We encourage anyone to ask at your local bookseller to order the book for you. It is obviously on Amazon because Amazon has everything. And there's usually a pretty good rate there. In our blog, thisamericanhouse.com, over in the sidebar menu, there's also a link to the book there.
Perfect. And with that answer, we'll bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenters, Jason and Michael. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having us, and everybody for humoring us as we could talk endlessly about this house. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
This has been great. And we hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look in some other fantastic programs we have coming up, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again on Thursday, September 22nd. Thank you all for joining us again today, and have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.